New Comics was National Allied's second ongoing series, and again featuring new material. Among the artists whose work featured in this title were Walt Kelly, Sheldon Mayer, and Vincent Sullivan. All three would be important to the development of the comic industry. New Comics number 2 started off 1936 with a Robert Leffingwell humor cover featuring sagebrush and cactus. This historic issue featured the first appearance of Federal Men, a 4-page comic story in the detective mystery genre by creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who later on would create Superman. This title featured the characters Steve Carson, Officer Walsh, and Kate Lane. Sheldon Mayer gave us the 2-page story J. Worthington Blimp, and also a 2-page sci-fi story, The Strange Adventures of Mr. Weed. And Walt Kelly gave us Gulliver's Travels, a 2-page story based on the classic novel. This was the last issue with this title. New Comics number 3 featured a Jimmy Jones cover by artist Vincent Sullivan. There was the return of J. Worthington Blimp, 2-page story by Sheldon Mayer, and also a 2-page version of Strange Adventures of Mr. Weed, the sci-fi story by Sheldon Mayer. S.M. Iger, under the alias of Maxwell, gave us a 1-page humor story called Court Chuckles. And Siegel and Schuster were back with a 4-page Federal Men story featuring the characters Morton Brent Jr. and Grayson. New Comics number 4 featured another Vincent Sullivan cover, possibly of Jimmy Jones. This was the last appearance of Strange Adventures of Mr. Weed, the sci-fi story from Sheldon Mayer, and also the last appearance of J. Worthington Blimp, the 2-page story from Sheldon Mayer. Siegel and Schuster gave us another Federal Men story, 2 pages long, featuring Steve Carson. Serena Sommerfeld, better known as Serene Sommerfeld, was born August 9, 1885, living until 1966. A commercial artist and early comic book artist, one of the earliest females to create original artwork. Her first known comics work was a 2-page sci-fi story called Stratosphere Special, which appeared in New Comics number 4 in March 1936 for National Allied. The second and last installment appeared in the next issue, New Comics number 5. She then took the concept to Henley Publications in the near-identical strip Space Limited, which was published in Wow, What a Magazine, issues 1 through 4. New Comics number 5 featured a Jimmy Jones cover by Whitney Ellsworth. Federal Men was back from Siegel and Schuster in a 2-page detective mystery story. And Craig Flessel gave us a black and white adventure featuring the first appearance of Steve Conrad in Steve Conrad Adventurer, a 2-page story. Craig Valentine Flessel, born February 2nd, 1912, lived until July 17th, 2008. An American comic book artist and illustrator and cartoonist for magazines ranging from Boy's Life to Playboy. One of the earliest comic book illustrators, Flessel drew the covers of many of the first American comic books, including the pre-Batman issues of Detective Comics number 2 through 19 in 1937 and 38. He both wrote and drew the 2-page Steve Conrad Adventurer story premiering in New Comics number 5, as well as the 2-page sports feature Pep Morgan premiering in More Fun number 12, also 1936. He also worked on Brett Lawton and Speed Saunders, which both premiered in Detective Comics number 1. Bradley Boyce premiered in More Fun number 13. As writer and artist, Flessel created the DC character The Shining Knight in Adventure Comics 66 in 1941. He is also the artist who drew the first cover appearance of the Golden Age Sandman in Adventure Comics number 40. Mima Gamble was an artist who drew an adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities for DC Comics' predecessor National Allied in New Comics number 4, running until New Adventure Comics number 25. New Comics number 6 came out the next month, featuring a fun humor cover story of Who Ate My Fish by artist Whitney Ellsworth. Steve Conrad was back in a 2-page story from Craig Flessel. Siegel and Schuster gave us another 2-page Federal Men story featuring Steve Carson, and it featured the president, who was not drawn as Roosevelt. New Comics number 7 featured humor cover by Whitney Ellsworth with a kid with a crab. Steve Conrad was back in a 2-page story from Craig Flessel. And Federal Man returned in a 4-page story by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the detective mystery featuring Steve Carson. New Comics number 8 featured a cover appearance by Whitney Ellsworth, his version of A Boy with Apples and a Man with a Gun. Craig Flessel was back with a Steve Conrad 2-page story, and Siegel and Shuster continued their Federal Man 4-page story in this one, featuring Steve Carson. And Blood Pearls was a 4-page story from writer Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, with pencils by Munson Paddock, under the alias of Pad. This adventure story featured Baslin, Dato Penang, and Cao Chung's daughter. Munson Leroy Paddock worked as a magazine and newspaper artist and later drew for the early comic book industry. Paddock illustrated comic strips like Mr. Bluff in 1907, Little Miss Thoughtful in 1908, and Naughty Ned in 1909. His art appeared in early National Allied and DC features like The Blood Pearls and Monastery of the Blue God. At Fox Comics, he was an artist of the features Chen Chang, The Green Mask, and Tex Mixon. Paddock drew Casey Jones for Quality, Rez King, and The Shadow for Street and Smith, as well as Ibis, Captain Midnight, and Mr. Scarlet for Fawcett. New Comics number 9 featured a cover by Whitney Ellsworth, featuring a kid, boxers, and referee on the cover. An interesting story called Straight from Hollywood appeared, featuring the characters Spanky McFarland from The Little Rascals, Boris Karloff, Harpo Marx, and Joe E. Brown. Craig Flessel was back with a 2-page story featuring Steve Conrad. Federal Men returned in a 4-page story from Siegel and Shuster. New Comics number 10 featured another Whitney Ellsworth cover, this one of A Boy and Girl with Pennants. Craig Flessel gave us a 1-page story called Do You Know, as well as a 2-page story, Steve Conrad Adventurer. Siegel and Shuster were back with a 4-page Federal Men detective mystery story. The final issue of the year was New Comics number 11. It was a Christmas cover by Whitney Ellsworth, featuring Christmas carolers on the cover. Craig Flessel was back with another Steve Conrad Adventurer 2-page story. And Siegel and Shuster returned once again with Federal Men, a 4-page detective mystery story. Alex Lovey, born September 2nd, 1913, lived until February 14th, 1992, an American animator who spent the majority of his career as an animator and director at Walter Lantz Productions. Lovey's early career was spent as a comic artist at DC, and he became an animator at the Lantz studio in the late 30s. Slim and Tex appear in New Comics number 11, as well as another strip by Lovey, Dale Daring.